Aloha! I'm totally thrilled about having Richard Heinberg with us. You know, as a campus, we're moving towards campus sustainability. Richard is moving the world towards sustainability in a different form of being on the planet. In our initiatives here at Hawaii Pacific University, fortunately last year we were able to hire a part-time campus sustainability coordinator. That position is now a full-time position, and the person in it is Josh Prigge. Some of you know Josh, but if you don't know him, I want to introduce him to you briefly, and Josh will then introduce our guest, Richard Heinberg. So Josh, stand up and let's give it Josh a hand.
So that's easier. Thank you all for coming. We're very excited to have Richard here. Like Art said, I'm the Sustainability Coordinator here. I graduated from the Global Leadership and Sustainable Development Program that Art is the program chair for. I was telling Richard on the way over here, The Party's Over was a book that I really loved. I recommended it to a number of people. It's a book that Richard wrote a few years back. And it's actually a book that Art recommended to me as I was joining the program. It's about peak oil and the need to transition to a world without fossil fuels. Like a lot of Richard's book, it's very interesting, very eye-opening, based on facts. Just a really good piece of work, as is the End of Growth here. Beyond writing many books, Richard presents across the country, in dozens of countries around the world. He's been in a number of documentaries, and he's considered one of the world leaders in peak oil education, and a very effective communicator of our need to transition to a world without fossil fuels. So I'm very excited to present Richard Heinberg. Please welcome Richard.
Thank you. Well, aloha. What a beautiful place. I can see why you live here. Well, what I'd like to do over the course of the next 45, 50 minutes is talk to you about my new book, The End of Growth, and then we'll have plenty of time after that, at least half an hour, for questions and discussion. I started the book in some ways back in 2008 when we had the big oil price spike and the collapse of the near collapse of Wall Street. In some ways, I started the book many years earlier. I think I was 21 years old when I first read a book called The Limits to Growth, which was the best-selling environmental book still of all time. And at that time, in 1972, I realized for the first time in my life that I was living in a society that was on a track that was fundamentally unsustainable. That the way things were going could not be maintained for very long. Now, what does that mean for very long? Well, it could mean centuries, could mean decades, could mean years. Clearly, world economic growth has continued up until virtually the present. I make the argument in my book that we are now in a transition period away from economic growth, and it's not being driven by policy, it's not being driven by people rising up and saying, oh, we don't want any more economic growth. It's being driven by events having to do with the environment and with the financial system. So let's unpack this. I'm going to argue that growth, economic growth worldwide is ending due to three factors, and I call it the 3 Ds: debt, depletion, and disaster. And I'm going to argue that each of these categories of events is directly or indirectly related to our reliance on fossil fuels. Okay, so why fossil fuels? What's the big deal about fossil fuels? Well, fossil fuels have created the world that we live in, the cultural and social and economic world that we take for granted. For 99% and more of our history as a species, we relied on renewable energy sources. Firewood, crops. We used muscle power in order to change our environment and get the things that we needed. But just a couple of hundred years ago, that changed. We developed certain tools and technologies, metallurgy, gears, simple heat engine, the steam engine. And those few simple inventions enabled us to extract and harness fossil fuels, which actually we had known about earlier, but we hadn't really had any effective way of using them. But once we began using fossil fuels, it was as though the genie was out of the bottle. Maybe you've had the experience of running out of gas in your car and having to push your car off to the side of the road. That's hard work, especially if it's a big car. Imagine pushing your car, let's say 20 or 30 miles. That's really a lot of work. That's the equivalent of maybe 3 months of hard labor. Okay, well, we get that done for us from a single gallon of gasoline for which we're paying $4 and complaining. Think about that. 3 months worth of human labor for $4. You can't get labor that cheap in China or India or anywhere else. That's why we have mechanized every process of production and transport that we possibly could over the course of the last century or so. Fossil fuels have given us an economic miracle. This is GDP per capita. Now, GDP growth is what we're really talking about here. It's the increase in the size of the economy, how much money is being spent in aggregate. And if you look at GDP over human history, there really wasn't very much growth. The idea that economies always grow is really a very recent idea, and it's an idea that's become implanted in our collective psyche just in the last century, really. A century of rapid economic growth due to the availability of fossil fuels. Now, this is per capita GDP growth. Now, during this same period of time, we were adding a lot more capitas. Human population was increasing from fewer than 1 billion at the start of the Industrial Revolution to 7 billion today. That's 7 times over in just a couple of hundred years. Extraordinary rate of population growth. I guess you could say that's extraordinary biological success for our species. How did we achieve it? Well, largely through fossil fuels, through better sanitation. But if you trace back what was going on with improvements in sanitation, most of those related indirectly to fossil fuels. And then the ability to produce more food and to transport resources further distances from where they're abundant to where they're scarce. Altogether, it's enabled us to increase Earth's carrying capacity for human beings. The big question of our lifetimes will be, was that a temporary increase in carrying capacity, or can it be made permanent? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a pretty important one. Well, here in the US, and of course I'm talking mostly about the continental US, the continental US was the epicenter of all of this economic growth because there were so many fossil fuels there: oil, coal, natural gas. The oil industry got started there. Other technologies really took root, like the automobile industry, the aircraft industry, and so on, because there were the cheap fuels to make those things go. So the problem in the early 20th century was actually one of overproduction. Using cheap fossil fuels, we could make stuff faster than people could buy it. So how did we solve that problem of overproduction? Well, in two ways. One was advertising, and of course I have a car ad here because the automobile was emblematic of the kinds of developments we're talking about. Using mass production assembly lines, it was possible to make cars in such numbers that everybody could own one, right? But in 1910, not everybody wanted to own a car or even thought it was possible because these were big ticket items. They cost, you know, like $950 for a Model T in 1910. It doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but in 1910, in dollars of that era, that was a lot. So using advertising, we were able to talk people into wanting these things, and that included some sub-strategies like planned obsolescence, making things so that they would reliably break down after a short period of time so you'd have to replace them, or changing the appearance of consumer objects so everybody would want the latest model. Okay, that was one strategy for solving the problem of overproduction. The other strategy was consumer credit, making it possible to buy big ticket items on credit to pay over a long period of time. So effectively increasing debt. Okay? Now, this again was a very effective strategy. But what it did was it led to increasing levels of debt, consumer debt, corporate debt, and so on. Now, as all of this was happening, the idea that the economy would continue to grow virtually forever became embedded again in our collective psyche. We even transitioned our monetary system. Money used to be linked to precious metals, gold and silver. But there was only so much gold and silver around. Meanwhile, we were capable of growing the economy with cheap, concentrated fossil fuels so rapidly that we couldn't dig enough we couldn't dig enough gold and silver out of the ground to make the economy grow as quickly as we otherwise could. So we disentangled money from precious metals. It happened gradually over the course of the century, but the final link was cut back in 1971. So what is money if it's not gold or silver? Well, it's debt. All of our money is debt. It's loaned into existence. When you go into a bank and take out a loan, the banker doesn't go into the vault and search around on the shelves. Let's say you're taking out a $10,000 loan. He doesn't search around on the shelves for $10,000 that somebody put there and doesn't have any use for right now. What happens is that the banker goes to her or his computer, makes a few keystroke entries, and suddenly there's $10,000 in your account. That $10,000 didn't exist previously. It's called into existence at the moment that the loan is made. And the moment you repay that loan, the $10,000 ceases to exist. It's magic. And it works, more or less, as long as the economy is growing. Why is economic growth important? Well, because when the banker makes that $10,000 loan, he or she does not at the same time create the extra money to enable you to make the interest payments on that loan. So where does the interest come from? Well, it comes from other people elsewhere in the economy